I'd like now to introduce our presenter today, Greg Lane. Greg worked for the Department of Immigration for 5 years, and Greg and I met on Christmas Island, where he was the Operations Director of the Christmas Island Immigration Detention Centre. Greg was also Centre Manager of Curtin and the Sherga Detention Centres, and until earlier this year, Greg was the Director of the Nauru Regional Processing Centre. Greg brings a wealth of experience and insight into this most polarising of issues. Please welcome Greg Lane.
Most people respond as soon as they hear that and say, how could someone so young have a wealth of experience in anything? But I assure you, I really don't. Minister Bowen, when he was Minister for Immigration, used to tell a story of me when he first introduced me to the town of Weipa, which is where Sherga Detention Centre is. He said to the community leaders and the president of the Shire Council, all those people, he said, I half expected Greg to come around the corner with a skateboard under his arm. And I thought that was a bit rich coming from Minister Bowen, because he actually was 25 when he became Mayor of Fairfield City Council, which is one of the largest city councils in Sydney, and was 42 when he was promoted to one of the senior cabinet roles within the then Labor government, or the Rudd government. So I thought it was a bit rich for him to pick on my age, but that's not what I'm here to talk about. I guess I just want to give a quick overview of where I worked. You've kind of already heard a little bit of it. I spent 12 months on Christmas Island, was there and finished my time shortly after the boat crash that you'll have all seen images of on telly. I then went up to Sherga Immigration Detention Centre, which I was the centre manager of while the riots on Christmas Island happened. And as part of that experience, the government transferred a lot of people from Christmas Island to other detention centres around the mainland, including Sherga, the one that I was managing. So we doubled our capacity in 7 days, from 400 to 800 people, using Hercules that fly in big tents, things like that. That was also the time when one of the people in detention died, so it wasn't my favourite week of work. After that, I went and worked in Canberra again, organising the offshore transfers, so all the transfers to Manus and Nauru, and also setting up the fast-track removal process, where over 1,000 people now have been returned to Sri Lanka using an enhanced screening process, which we'll see if we get time to talk about later on. They then kicked me up to Curtin Immigration Detention Centre in WA and on to Nauru, where I was there during the kind of lip-sewing events and some of the protest action that you might have heard of earlier this year. I quit. I resigned politely and certainly not begrudgingly earlier this year at the end of March, and finished up formally in April. So it's all very fresh for me, and I would say that I'm still digesting a lot of what happened. But I can today reflect on some of the experiences, particularly of how government policy and government policies that I felt were made very quickly and in a response to things that were unexpected from the government. And I can tell you how I felt they played themselves out on the ground. I'm not trying to convince anyone. It takes a hell of a lot more than 20 minutes to convince anybody of issues around asylum seekers, and I'm sure that in this room we have as many people as we do opinions, if not more. And I guess the idea for me today is to share a little bit about how I experienced the world, what I have learned from it, and also how I then digest it. What is the framework through which I'm going to go and think about that experience, and have been all along? And we're at City Bible Forum, so you'll probably be not that surprised to hear that is from a Christian perspective and as somebody who believes in Jesus. But I'll get to that later on. So I thought I'd just share a few little stories that you might find helpful to sort of personalise some of the stuff that you see on telly. And the first one, you hear a lot about mental health and the impact of immigration detention, which is, for all intents and purposes, arbitrary and indefinite, on people in immigration detention who often arrive at that place with an underlying mental health condition such as post-traumatic stress, they're victims of torture and trauma, or even if they're not, they've probably suffered a great deal of stress in their family life because of either persecution or just because they come from a country that's not that great. And I remember one kid arriving, and I won't share his name, but he was about 12, maybe 11 or 12, and he came by boat, as all of the asylum seekers on Christmas Island do, except for one who came by air. That's not even going to enter into today's discussion, but the boats come, and when people step off the boat, for the immigration department, it marks the beginning of a long process. But for people who have arrived at Christmas Island and stepped off that barge onto the jetty, of course, it's the end of a long journey. And I remember when this kid got off with his mother and his sister. He was obviously traumatised. He was very closed and had no interaction visible at all with anybody but his mother. And for quite a few weeks, including including during that first day when we do a lot of initial processing, he was someone who was just very hard to interact with and engage with at all, which was it was unusual even among that group of people. And he was a bit of a project for me. I decided that I was going to take him on as someone I wanted to crack through that barrier because I didn't know how many other people would have that opportunity. And so every time I went up to the family centre on Christmas Island, which is at a place called Construction Camp, it was the old construction workers facility where they lived while they were building the main detention centre. I'd go up there and I'd go and say hello to him and just find him and say hi whenever I went up to that centre. And he eventually kind of, he never responded. He always just kind of ran away when he saw me coming. But one day I was actually chatting with his mother. And I hadn't been able to find him, so I'd gone looking for him. I hadn't been able to find him. I found his mother, was chatting to his mother, and I felt this kind of tug on the back of my shirt. I thought, what the heck? Who'd know it? Because it's very unusual for someone to touch an immigration officer because they freak out. I was in my full-on immigration outfit and everything. He tugged me on the back, and he turned around, and there's this kid, and he just points at me and he says, "You're Spider-Man," and he bolts off the other way. And after that, I thought, man, I totally cracked that guy. So I chased him, of course, and we ran all around construction camp, and I chased this kid. Finally caught him and said, "No, I'm not, I'm Batman." And he loved it, and we had this great conversation, and every time I went up there, he would come and chase me down and find me and say, "No, you're Spider-Man." We had this big fight about it. And I think for me, that story, or that experience, was one of those ones where I go, hang on a second. We hear all those stories about people being vulnerable. We hear all those stories about people being, the down and outers, people who've been persecuted, who struggle with some of the most difficult situations back home, so difficult, in fact, that they flee for whatever reason. And we often don't realise that we're actually talking about real people. We talk about the numbers of people on each boat, the nationalities they're from. We talk about 30,000 people forecasted for the next 12 months, or the forward estimates for the next 12 months, and then beyond that for the forward estimates saying 30,000 arrivals, wow, we're getting overrun, but actually each and every one of those 30,000 people is an individual. And even if they don't have a protection claim under the UN Convention, they're still an individual person. And there's still someone who's probably left in search of something better than what they had back home. Whether it's because they are persecuted or not is open for debate. In each case, the story's probably different. But I think we need to keep in mind that we're actually talking about individuals here. And that story for me really drove that home. When I was towards the end of my time on Christmas Island, I was beginning to get very tired. And one of the reasons for that was that I'd get late night phone calls. I don't think there was a single week on Christmas Island where I didn't get a phone call between the hours of 11 PM and 4 AM at least one day in the week. And what you'd get is a call from usually a Customs Border Protection, the lead Customs Border Protection guy called Colin, on the island saying there's a boat that's been viewed by an Orion, one of the observation planes that were based out of Cocos, and would actually try and spot the boats on the way there. And the reason, I guess, those, apart from being tired from those phone calls, the reason those phone calls were so challenging was because usually what happens is they say, we think there's about 60 people on board, the boat's taking on water, or even there are people in the water. Now, say they're Afghans, hypothetically. There are a lot of Afghans who arrived in 2010 while I was there. They can't swim. It's a landlocked country, no swimming skills whatsoever. So when there are people in the water, very, very small window of opportunity to go and get them. The Navy's job was to go and do that, and from inside my little apartment in Christmas Island, there was nothing I could do, but I still got a phone call because we had to prepare for the arrival. So when the boat crash at the end of the year happened, I was moved by the same images you were moved by, and realised that what was going on there was a horrific tragedy regardless of who was on board. And it came home most when I got a phone call from the hospital on Christmas Island, which is a government-funded, Commonwealth government-funded hospital just for the local community initially, where they called me up and said, look, we've run out of body bags. And I knew they had 20. And at that point I'm like, wow, we're in for some serious stuff now. They asked if we had any that we could share. We also organised an additional reefer, which is one of those truck containers you see with like a refrigerated container, because they needed more walk space. And it was one of those phone calls that just, I'll relive that moment for a long time. The next day, or a few days later, the swell calmed down a little bit, and I went snorkeling. And I was snorkeling for me on Christmas Island was a way out, a way of kind of just time out for Greg. I'm going snorkeling, it's a beautiful, beautiful island with amazing coral. If you ever get there, you've got to go snorkeling in the cove. And I'm snorkeling around the cove, trying to run away from the reef sharks and things like that. And I was in my own world, having some time out after what was another shocking week of my professional career. And I looked down into some of the deeper coral, about 4 or 5 metres down, and there was a red scarf that had been caught in some of the coral. And it brought home and brought back all of that previous few days' experience, because what I realised was that this scarf, which was a girl's scarf, was small, was actually the scarf of one of the victims of that crash. And so it was inescapable how traumatic the experience was for the people on board, for the survivors, for the men who were at Northwest Point Immigration Detention Centre watching it unfold on the TV screens, knowing that their family were on board. Those are the people who we have to deal with every day. So I guess I'm not going to keep harping on about Christmas Island too much, but I guess for me the take home is that as a public servant, my role was to implement government policy. The job of an immigration officer or any public servant is to take what the government decides and make it happen. And then, from the experience that they have and the expertise you develop over a period of time as an agency, advise government on what you think they should do. That's really fundamentally the role of a public servant. It's not actually to do any more than advise the government and implement. But it doesn't mean we have to agree. And often the public service is very good at explaining to ministers why they disagree and why they think the politics has overtaken events that shouldn't really be dealt with the way the politicians want to. But they don't always listen. So I guess those stories of real people are the things that most people miss out on if you just watch the public discussion. It's the stuff you can't appreciate if you're just watching telly. And even ministers who travel to Christmas Island rarely happen to be there at the time when events like that occur. And even when they are, they don't really get to see it the way people who work there and live there are involved in these sort of events. So when I was in Canberra, we were at the tail end of the unpicking of the Labor government's solution to this issue. Labor, when they came to power, when Cameron came to power, they came from the 2007 election platform, which essentially went through and unpicked absolutely every element of border protection that the Howard government had set up, including the vast majority of the Pacific solution. And really the only tenet of that system that they maintained was the system of mandatory detention. And even that they changed to say we're no longer going to detain women and children in detention centres. We're going to look at alternative places of detention. And they, within 18 months, the Labor government, to their credit, had said this is what we're going to do to this policy, and they'd done it. They had completely unpicked. They closed Nauru. They brought remaining Nauru asylum seekers to Australia for processing. They'd taken women and children out of detention. They'd canned temporary protection visas, and they'd done exactly what they said they would do. Unfortunately, I don't think they realised what implications that would have in terms of arrivals, and it's no secret to anyone, including the government now, that there is absolutely a pull factor in terms of local government policy, and the government knew that, and the department advised them as such. We knew that this was going to be in effect. Now, they'd done what they said they were going to do. The boats started coming along. And so they went through this process of beginning to reinstate all sorts of things that they were trying to do. When they had to deal with capacity problems, with too many people in detention, they would go and open new detention centres, or they'd come up with ideas of expanding the community detention program to include people who were IMAs, irregular maritime arrivals, boat people. And so they would go through these knee-jerk policy reactions saying, all right, well, we'll put people in the Australian community then, because that means we don't have to keep them in detention centres. They're in detention still, but it's community detention. And that's fine, it makes sense, except in doing that, they actually make it attractive for people to then further get on boats. Especially when you target families for community detention, what that means is families get on boats. Simple as that. It sounds so simple, but actually at the time it was very difficult to realise that that was going to be the implication. So we got to the point where the Malaysia idea came up. And it's like, well, this is a good idea. If we can say, no, you shouldn't get on a boat, because if you do, all that's going to happen is you're going to end up exactly where you started. Back in Malaysia, it doesn't work. It's not helpful. And conceptually, it kind of makes sense. You go, okay, if we can convince people not to get on the boat because it's not going to have any benefit, fantastic, right? That means getting into the mind of someone who's about to step on the boat, sure, but if you can do it, it's flawless, right? It doesn't consider the impact of the policy on those 800 people, but that's something that I'm sure there's plenty of people with views on. And that didn't work because the High Court got in the way, and that was a bit annoying for a while. And the effect was that the government had very few policy options left but to look at Manus and Nauru. My job with Manus, so not Nauru, with Manus Island was to select the people for transfer. Not so much the individuals, but to actually advise on what criteria a person needed to meet in order to be transferred. So what would happen was they would say, I would get all this information from all over the department and compile a set of criteria such as, we're trying to go for 35 people to be transferred on Sunday at 5 a.m. They're going to get up and the plane's going to go at 9:30 or whatever. Got a plane lined up ready to be on Christmas Island in time. 35 people is our target number. They need to be this nationality or these nationalities in these family groups, and we want people of this, with children of this age, we want them between 7 and 11. And what we want to do is and the minister would tell us that they want as many young children as possible, but not so young that they're unable to be inoculated against all the diseases on Manus Island, such as malaria and Japanese encephalitis. So that would give us this is who we want and how many we want. It was my job to then go and work out what criteria it would be to get that group of people, say to Christmas Island, pick the people off the list, put them on the plane. And we would transfer people like that. And so what would happen is you go, okay, that makes sense because we're trying to stop people with young kids getting on boats. So what you do is you transfer them to Manus. It's a disincentive, a deterrent. It makes perfect sense because what you're trying to do is you're trying to encourage people down lawful channels and discourage unlawful channels. That sounds like good policy to me, right? That's how the Houston report is developed. That expert panel came out with basically a set of policy ideas, none of which were new, but all of which promoted this idea that we should go down encourage lawful channels and discourage unlawful channels. The effect of that is that deterrence looks like me saying, go and get as many 8-year-olds to put on a plane to Manus. By the way, even having been inoculated against malaria, 1 in 100 people and more like 1 in 20 children will still get it, of which quite a substantial percentage of children who contract malaria die from it. So I'm getting these lists and saying, I'm trying to get you guys to get this many young children so we can send them to a place where it might not be a huge chance, but there's still a pretty big chance they'll die. Great, fantastic job, I love my life. That's the kind of situation I found myself in, and at that point they sent me to Nauru. On Nauru, the conditions were better than I thought. They were better than I thought because I expected Nauru to be a hellhole. And while the country itself has got its own social and political challenges at the moment, the centre itself was actually very well designed and being constructed at an amazing pace and of good quality. And the service providers there, the contracted service providers who look after medical health, mental health, garrison services, security services, education, welfare, and all of those things actually were doing an outstanding job in the vast majority of cases. There are issues, but there always are. They were excellent. It was a good operation and it was running well when I arrived, even having only been set up a few months beforehand. But the government, the Australian government and the Nauruan government were still in arguments about the arrangements under which the processing of asylum claims would be done. So what happened was we had this overarching MOU, Memorandum of Understanding, between the two governments to say we're going to set up regional processing in your country. The Nauruans were going, fantastic, we have got no phosphate left, so we need the cash. And the Australian government were going, it kind of sucks to be us, we're the wrong party to be doing this, but we've got to do it, we've got no choice. So they set up this MOU and said underneath that will sit a series of administrative arrangements, which are the more detailed kind of, it's kind of like, legislation versus regulation if you're a lawyer. It's that kind of, I guess that kind of power. So the administrative arrangements are less binding but more detailed, if you like. And under that arrangement, the Nauruan government wanted a lot of money and a lot of other support to set up this processing of asylum claims. The way that works is you set up a register that the UNHCR accredits and says, okay, you are able to determine whether or not someone is a refugee under the convention. And under that convention, you then are able to allocate that person a case, determine whether they're a refugee or not, and then if they are, that is then registered so that when they apply for asylum in a country, that country already know they've been assessed. Now, to do that is for someone to sit down and make that assessment about it, it takes a lot of training and a lot of effort. The Nauruans had never done it before. In fact, the Australian officers who make those determinations spend at least 6 months learning and practicing and training in order to be able to make those kinds of assessments with all the country information that's available to them after a series of interviews with the individual, all sorts of things that go into that assessment. Anyway, I'm getting to a point, don't worry, I'm not just talking about asylum claims, but The Nauruan government didn't have the capacity, doesn't have the capacity, and so they want the Australian government to give it to them in the form of both money and people. But the Australian government were like, we don't want to we don't want to make the assessments. We don't want the Australian officers to be the ones who do the assessments. So I arrived on Nauru at a time when the people who'd been transferred there had been transferred according to a set of criteria, much like the ones I was using to send people to Manus. In fact, I developed the same ones for Nauru as well. So they were there because they were reflective of a group of people we were trying to deter. They were from a certain nationality. They were certain ages. They'd arrived at certain times. They'd come from certain places. They'd been using certain people smugglers, whatever, right? The criteria were there. And so we'd select the people and send them there. So you might have arrived as an individual from Indonesia, you get over 60 other people, and you're one of 3 of those 60 who ended up on Nauru. So your main question is, why me and not them? And how long am I going to be here for, right? That's what you care about at that point. Which were the 2 questions that I constantly got when I spoke to the people, the asylum seekers on Nauru. And of course the second question, how long am I going to be here for, is contingent on the answer to the question, how long is it going to take for me to find out whether you're a refugee? Which I didn't know because there was politics going on between the Nauruan government, which was in disarray already by the time February hit, and the Australian government, who didn't want to give all the money because they were running out. And they were trying to, at that point, they just announced they were going to do they weren't going to get a surplus, but that was still pretty tight, right? So we've got this political thing going on over there about these admin arrangements. It's just so conceptual to somebody who's actually in the centre. And all they want to know is, why me, and how long am I going to be here for? So I had to go in there and say, I don't know. I actually don't know how long you're going to be here for. And even if you go through your assessment and you're found to be a refugee under whatever process we end up coming up with, there's no guarantee you're going to be resettled in Australia. In fact, New Zealand have just said they're going to take 150 people from this process. Fantastic. So I have no idea where you're going to go. I have no idea how long it's going to take. And in the meantime, you guys get to hang about here in Nauru. Now, the worst part for me, and one of the main reasons I ended up leaving, was because there comes a point as an immigration officer and as a human being that that's not sustainable. I didn't feel it was ethical and I didn't feel it was right. That people who have actually genuinely been selected at random in many ways are subjected to this regardless of their story or their background. I don't think that's helpful at all for a person, and I think it only exacerbates underlying mental health conditions or creates them if they weren't there already. Now, the worst part of my job was having to front a group of about this many people from a particular nationality, and we do them in nationalities because we use an interpreter who could speak to a whole group rather than having 6 interpreters do everything. So we'd meet them in groups, and for one series of meetings through the 6 or 7 nationalities or language groups present, I had to say, I don't know when your processing will start, even though I knew that it was going to start on the 18th of March. The reason I was told not to say anything was because the government wanted to announce when the processing would start. They wanted to make sure that the announcement that, yes, we're making a move towards this would happen at a particular time and convenient to their media cycles, presumably. Now, to make it worse, the group of people who I was talking to in one case had 8 people with their lips sewn, and a group of about 25 people who hadn't eaten for more than 10 days. Now, if you know anything about starvation, or particularly when you're not drinking, 10 days is a long time to be without food and water. There were most of them were drinking, but there were people who had been 12 days without consuming water, and we knew it because we observed them most of the time. Now, I don't know how you survived that long without water, but these guys did it, and they were detrimental, probably long-term damage, medical damage as a result. And I'm standing there saying, I can't tell you what I do know, because I've been instructed not to. And then the Prime Minister came out and said, we don't negotiate with people who are protesting. We're not prepared to tell anybody anything, and we're not going to start the protesting until all that sort of behaviour stops. And so here I am saying, Prime Minister's just said, I can't tell you anyway, until you stop the voluntary starvation, you unsew the libs, and you stop doing these daily demonstrations. But I knew that if I told them the date, all that would stop anyway. But that's how this game works. And if you think that it's because the people in that situation were trying to be manipulative, maybe they were. But you know what? I'd probably do the same, to be honest. Because if I was in that situation where I felt I'd been selected at random, regardless of the backstory, where if I felt I'd been selected at random, no one could give me anything about what was about to happen next, I'd probably start trying all sorts of things to actually convince the person up there who I know has the information to tell me what I need to know or what I'm after. I don't think that's illegitimate. And I don't think it was done out of a malicious heart. I think it was done out of desperation. And that's the actual experience of what it felt like on the ground. Now, I am not a supporter of any particular political party. As a public servant, I have no obligation to share my political views. I'm not a public servant now, and I can tell you, so I can tell you what I think politically, but I can tell you that I'm not a supporter of a particular political party because I do not feel that any political party in this country has adequately addressed this problem in a way that it accommodates for its complexities. And if I look at that issue as a public policy issue and as a Christian, I realise that the only kind of policy solution that we could have for this has to come from a place where the default, the fundamental basis on which that policy development happens is that people are valuable, that people matter. And it doesn't matter where they were born. That accident of birth thing, that's just an irrelevancy in this discussion. Because even if someone doesn't have a claim under the UNHCR Convention, chances are they were experiencing serious financial hardship and economic strife. Chances are, even if it might not be a convention, they didn't have a great life beforehand. And I'm not suggesting their life in Australia is going to be much better. Hopefully it will be. But who knows, right? But I'm not the one to make that call. But from my perspective, if we are in a position where stupid policies made in knee-jerk reactions to political issues affect people in the ways that I saw, we've missed something along the way. Because the people who I met, regardless of their backstories, were still people. And as a Christian, when God says, people matter to me, they're made in my image, and the way you treat those children, and the way you treat those widows and vulnerable people, is the way that you're treating me, that's got to be the default. Now, if you're not a Christian, I reckon you can still come to the same conclusion from a humanist perspective. I reckon you can still come to the same conclusion from pretty much any worldview that you might hold, whatever. But I think we can all agree that at the end of the day, people are important, people do matter, and the policy solution to this complex issue has to revolve around that principle, or we've done something wrong. That's my view, that's some of my story, and if you've got any questions, I'm happy to take them.
Terrific.